Greetings and welcome to the Elephant TV. My name is Joe Kobuthi. Today I'll be speaking to Sheila Masinde. Sheila is the Executive Director of Transparency International in Kenya. I welcome Sheila to the Elephant.
Thank you, Joe, for interviewing me today.
To start this conversation, for the last 20 years or so, part of the governance conversation in this country has been, the more we liberalize the economy, we also have to do a lot of political reform. And that part of this political reform came with, that we have to make our institutions accountable, transparent, the whole corruption conversation. In your view, 22 years, almost 25 years since, 1990s wave, how far have we gone as a country towards meeting this?
I think on paper, there's been quite a lot of progress on paper in regard to the development of key legislations and also policy, and also the setup of institutions to strengthen transparency and accountability in Kenya. When you look at legislations like the Anti-Corruption and Economic Crimes Act, the Public Officers Ethics Act, the public procurement laws, the access to information laws, and many others, because there are also some accountability-focused provisions scattered across various other legislations, and of course even our constitution that was promulgated in 2010. I think that is very good progress in terms of having certain our vision in terms of accountability, integrity in this country put down on paper. Now, the problem has been in the implementation, and that's where we've been stuck for now a few years now, because despite these laws, would have expected that now would be basically doing much better in the promotion of integrity, the fight against corruption. But when you look at our performance, even in global indices that measure public sector corruption, we are seemingly still struggling, underperforming, below the global average, not doing well even continentally when you compare with other countries. Some who have even what I would say weaker legal and legislative infrastructure and constitutional frameworks that support the fight against corruption, but are doing better than us, then you really then start to question why we have not translated what we have on paper into practice in terms of ensuring that there's more accountability, more openness, and particularly in terms of even, we have institutions that have followed the constitution, the constitutional provisions, particularly chapter 15 of the constitution, which provides for key independent offices and institutions, which are supposed to really ensure that that constitution is implemented in its spirit and letter. But there's a feeling that some of these institutions have not really performed. Maybe it is something to do with their independence. There's still been some level of political infiltration or manipulation in some of them, but there's also been an attempt to weaken them, functionally and also financially, because the moment they don't have that financial or functional autonomy, then it means they're still under the executive and just acting on the whims of the executive. And that's what I would say has really stopped Kenya, from living the dream of the Constitution of Kenya 2010, and also fully implementing some of the laws that have been put in place. Coupled with that, of course, we have to look at the political goodwill, to fight corruption, to promote good governance, and I think for me, when I think about the political goodwill to address corruption and the fight against corruption, that happened in fits and starts. We seemingly get to a point where there seems to be a high, and we have all this political rhetoric and pronouncements and the commitments that are made to address corruption, but then there seems to be no follow through, because I get the sense that most of this has just been for the sake of scoring, political, gains, but not really to ensure that there's real, true reform in this country. When you look at even some of the actions that happened say in the last regime from 2015, particularly starting with the list of shame, that was the list of individuals in office, in public office, that were being investigated or had been taken to court, and the president then asked that they step aside, and most of them did actually, but then those cases, most of them went nowhere. And then from 2017, there was an effort through the ESCC, the DCI, all these cases being investigated of high-profile individuals, many of them serving in public office, many of them proceeded to court. But then in the last 5 months, those are the cases that we are seeing collapsing. Either by the ODPP filing for their withdrawal, or some of those accused actually being acquitted by the courts. So you then ask yourself, okay, there seemed to be somewhere we're going, but then seemingly not. And then you almost feel like all this could have been in your imagination, yeah? Because we're all these efforts in the last 6 or so years, but then now we're told, actually there was no case there. So you then question the independence of some of these key institutions that are charged and mandated to fight corruption, and also the political goodwill to let these institutions work, and to let people who have been responsible for theft of massive resources in this country, carry their own cross.
You mentioned something around goodwill, and what is it about the political culture of Kenya, such that, as you rightly said, we have passed all this legislation, we have built institutions to fight corruption, but there's almost a disconnect between the macro policy and legal remedies, and the subtext of norms, attitudes, behavior change, that our political culture can't rehabilitate itself to now become a corrupt society. What is it about our political culture that makes it this way?
It's just the political culture is guided by impunity. We know, and our politicians know, that no one is going to hold them accountable. In the last few years, we thought that the courts would ensure that there's that accountability and ensure that people who are responsible are then punished. We've only seen a few people, yes. We've seen some cases proceeding to conviction, and people actually going to prison, a few people, but not many. And that still gives you the sense of the level of impunity. That sense of utadu. Like, I will still steal, I will go to a public office, I will leave it there, I will steal, literally leave a strong institution and finish it and steal and leave it to the ground bare, but nothing is going to happen to me, because I am on the right side politically. And you have even seen that many politicians, especially, and that's the sense I get, that when you have been on the wrong side of the law, you try to get on the right side politically, so that you can then be redeemed. But that's really because of the high level of impunity, because we have failed to punish the corrupt. And also just I would also attribute it also partly to the corruption of our systems. We are not quite sure whether some of our institutions, our key institutions, whether it is the courts and some of these independent institutions are purely independent. And so that's why many times you find people questioning judgments or decisions or processes. We've also seen there's been a bit of concern also with the high level of, I would say, corruption, even in the judicial system. I mean, when we did conducted our last bribery index which was published in 2020, the judiciary topped that list of the most bribery-prone institution. What confidence does that give you? In regard to then its independence or ability to be able to ensure that people who are responsible for corruption are then punished. So there are questions around that, because it seems like impunity always seems to overpower our institutions. But other than that, it's just bare greed. That's what I would attribute it to. that the political elite, political class have just demonstrated greed. You want to be as wealthy, and amass as much as the person who was in office, before you, forgetting that right now there's really little to steal in Kenya. We are struggling as an economy. So there's really little, but politicians don't seem to care that whether there's nothing or not, whether we have a high we're crumbling at a high level of debt, or Kenyans are struggling with the cost of living and inflation, that you still must leave that public office with something that belongs to the public. I just attribute it to bare greed, but it's just something also. It tells you something about our norms and culture. There's a point at which I think that our corruption became almost accepted, normal, and it's unfortunate that now progressively generations that have, as we continue to grow, have now believed that it's normal. I mean, you steal from the public, that's normal. If you steal, I mean, if I steal 10 shillings, from someone, I mean, that will be criticized, that will make headline news. But if I steal 15 billion, I mean, oh my goodness, that's so much money. That's okay, that's normal. That's almost the lopsided view that we have of theft in this country, because you don't hear that hue and cry of Kenyans, going after people who have been accused or even found guilty of stealing. I mean, you've seen even for people, say, who are found guilty of theft or misappropriation of funds or abuse of office, even for those who are, found guilty, but then given the option to pay fines. The moment they pay fines, look at the number of citizens who wait for them outside the courts to celebrate that they have, been set free because they've been able to pay for fines, despite the fact that they were found guilty. What does that tell you about the attitude that we have around theft by politicians and our acceptance, that we accept them? We've had people saying that, yes, ameiba, lakini huyo ni mwizi wetu. And then they go straight from the courts to vie for public office, and those are the people who get elected over the clean people. So I think we've kind of normalized theft. I'll not even call it corruption. We've normalized theft such that we find it okay to steal large amounts of money, but you will only stigmatize people who steal, the village thieves and other smaller thieves who steal. Though theft, whether it's of 1 shilling or 100 billion or so, that is still theft, and we really must name and shame and stigmatize, anyone who gets away with anything that belongs to someone else, especially when it comes to the taxpayers' resources.
Speaking of naming and shaming, the Kenya Kwanza government, there are those, high-level individuals, particularly during the campaign season, who came out and said the agenda of corruption is not on the agenda. It's not on the agenda of the Kenya Kwanza team and the government. In your view, someone who has really spent time, championing governance and anti-corruption, what does that do for a state that has been doing badly in the fight against graft? What does that do?
I mean, not just what does it do, but what has it done already? Precisely. Because what has happened already is that we now, because of that, can I say, deprioritization of anti-corruption and even leadership and integrity tenets, you then ensure that your cronies and allies who have been accused of theft of public resources are the same people now responsible for public resources, because you have basically sent our Chapter 6 of the Constitution on leadership and integrity to Coventry, and that is dangerous, especially at this point in our country where we are struggling with resources. I mean, every other day you're seeing news and statements from the Treasury saying that we don't have money. We've dug ourselves into a deep dark hole that we will take time to get out of. Those warning signals keep coming from, it's either the DP or the president or the Treasury CS, who are always making those statements every other day. That's what you hear. But yet, when you look at the priority that they've given for anti-corruption, then you wonder, okay, so what exactly is going on? Because for me, if we are to get any gains from our economy or return our economy to a functional state or to rehabilitate it, we have to put anti-corruption, you have to put good governance at the center of it. Because already we have to admit that corruption is responsible for where we are as an economy. Corruption in terms of monies that were borrowed, there was no accountability for a lot of money when you look at some of the projects that were financed by loans. When you look at even what was being financed by government from taxpayers' resources, there's been no accountability. And that's why we're where we are now. So I would have expected that anti-corruption would have been basically a buttressing pillar, for all the programs of the new, any government, whether it was Labin Azimio or Kenya Kwanza, yeah? Because you have to ring fence, basically. You have to ring fence those little resources that you now say we have, from theft. But I don't see that happening. Looking at the people who have been, who have issues, and which citizens, civic agencies have long been highlighting that these people have issues and should not have been allowed anywhere near a public office, but now they're there. So I really then doubt whether we'll be able to grow this economy with the kind of people who are there, because you don't entrust someone with issues. We should have actually let them, because again, the other question that I have is, or a concern rather, is some of these people who are again processed very quickly through the criminal justice system, where you have people who had cases. Some of those cases, a lot of those cases have collapsed. I think we have now almost 11 or 12 cases which have collapsed. Some of these people went straight from the dock to take public appointments, to sit in public office. And I think that they should have been allowed to go through the full trial process. So that, if the court pronounces them as innocent, well and good. But we didn't even get the opportunity to let the court pronounce itself, because those applications for withdrawal were made. And I think that's why I then even doubt or cast aspersions on the priority that this particular current government has put in regard to the fight against corruption. And there are many Kenyans, there are so many Kenyans who could have been able to perform those roles that have been given to people with, questionable character, or who had, questions to answer in regard to their conduct, management of public resources in their previous capacities. There are many Kenyans who could have done those jobs. We don't have a shortage of qualified professionals who could have worked in some of these offices. So I don't still understand why we had to have those particular people, unless we want to use their skills and expertise in terms of siphoning public resources to continue that venture of stealing public resources from the public. But what I would encourage this new government to do is really put good governance and particularly anti-corruption strategies and mechanisms at the center of their plan to redeem Kenya from the current economic situation.
But Sheila, there are those who would argue that looking at other models, particularly like the Asian models, China, etc., that we are seeing countries elevate themselves out of poverty and move into middle income level and even higher, yet corruption was not at the center of their governance model. What would you say about that? Because I think there are some within even the current government who that's their thinking. How would you respond to that?
I don't think then that kind of development is sustainable. It's not sustainable at all. You only need to look even at like Transparency International has done studies on the so-called developed countries, the studies called Trouble at the Top, where you seemingly see countries doing very well, but then they have actually facilitated corruption, not just in their countries, but in other foreign countries. Even if you look at some of the, for example, development projects that have been supported by our partners, development partners who have not put governance at the center. Look at the corruption scandals that have been born from these projects. Look at SGR, for instance. How many corruption scandals came out of there from issues around procurement, bribery, influence peddling, cronyism. We had even cases in terms of the acquisition of land and those bribery involved. I mean, and there are some of these cases I know are still in court. Yeah, but that's just as an example, because we didn't put governance at the center of it. Look at another case is the construction of the Nyali Bridge, which has also been criticized for alleged corruption in the bidding process. So, I mean, the examples are there for all to see, because there was no emphasis on good governance. And for us, what we've been pushing for is that when development partners are supporting this country, because we want to continue receiving that support, particularly looking at where this country is. But we're also urging development partners to embrace accountability models, ensure there's a component of social accountability, that citizens are able to access information, particularly financial information. How much are you giving the government? What specifically is it for? Open up those budgets and transactions for Kenyans to be able to monitor. Open up those tendering processes for Kenyans to be able to monitor those processes, so that and make sure that there's public participation, to ensure that there's accountability in terms of how money is being used, because this money is also coming from other taxpayers, from other citizens in other parts of the world. So it's important that governance is placed at the center of it. So that's actually a call that we've made to development partners, the Chinese, the Western countries as well, that they must ensure that there's a component of social accountability, public participation, access to information, to ring fence those resources from theft.
Before I let you go, I think in 2015, John Givongo made a statement and said that fighting corruption has reached a glass ceiling, and when he was referring to here, building institutions, passing laws, policy, particularly at the macro level, has hit a glass ceiling. Then, in your view, as ED of TI, what's the next terrain of anti-corruption? What's the new paradigm? How do we start engaging the youth and other people, other stakeholders who were not particularly the mainstay stakeholders, to reinvigorate this struggle such that moving forward, the fight against graft can, one, get life of its own, but have a new paradigm of thinking that becomes not just relevant, but has resonance with the people?
Definitely. Right now where we are, I think we need to see, we really need to innovate interventions touching on anti-corruption. And one way of doing this, in fact, I don't know that it's innovation or just going back to the basics, because I advocate that we need to just go back to understand ourselves as human beings. And as I mentioned earlier, we seem to have gotten to a stage where corruption is accepted. It's celebrated. It's normal, and we need to get to a point where we just really understand human beings. Why do they behave the way they do? So kind of just understand the psychology of ourselves as Kenyans, so we can be able then to understand better why we behave the way we do. And for me, that's the only way we'll be able now to start, looking into, just going back to basics in terms of good manners, because corruption really is something to do with just how we behave. Because it comes from an individual. Before we start looking at corruption within institutions, it actually starts from an individual. It's an individual sitting somewhere in a particular office, in a particular place of responsibility, who agrees to be corrupted. Or it's someone who approaches that particular individual and offers to corrupt him. But why? So we need to understand that. And so we need to go through a process of behavior change as Kenyans. And it has to start from, that 4-year-old, 3-year-old starting school. We need to start this process. In fact, I say, when I think about it, I would probably think around programming and starting with maybe say kids right now between 4 and 8, because it's these people who in say 10 to 15 years who will be maybe voting for the first time. And how corrupt we are is often reflected in how we vote and the decisions we make at the ballot. Because the more accepting of corruption that we are, the more we are accepting towards individuals who are not ethical and who have integrity issues. And that's what we've seen in the previous elections. We're increasingly voting for people who don't meet the leadership and integrity standards as prescribed in the Constitution. Basically, people who, say, in traditional or in older society, say in 100 or 200 years ago, would not even be given a responsibility to even take care of a neighbor's, herd of cattle because they had issues. But here we are, allowing them to run institutions and control billions and billions of shillings. But it also speaks to us as individuals because we have accepted those people and their conduct as normal. So we need to go through a process of behavior change. So crafting a behavior change model that will inspire cultural and individual behavior change in this country, for me, is critical. So I'd say that is part of going to the basics. But in terms of innovation, because now a lot of processes have gone digital with the increasing use of technology, even for government transactions, government services, and so on. I think we need to see how we maybe push more for transparency in an openness of these platforms. So we're able to monitor, financial transactions and other processes in government. I think the other thing that we need to see more, just to fuel the fight against corruption, is more collaboration amongst like-minded individuals, actors, the progressives who want to see a change in this country. We can't afford to work in our silos and individually anymore. We must come together because we must catalyze a critical mass of actors who can be able to push for change. I think many of us are fighting this in our own corners, and that's why we're getting worn out and tired, so fast, and giving up and getting frustrated. But I believe if we are more intentional in terms of coming together as institutions across civil society, private sector, the religious sector as well, and also just getting progressive-minded individuals, Kenyans, who really want to see a change in this country, we need to come together. Yeah, because that collaboration, that movement building is more important now, more than ever.
Thank you so much, Sheila, for your time here at The Elephant.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak on pertinent issues in this country.